With fentanyl, I believe currently with the pressure of Donald Trump after the threat of tariffs, Mexico will effectively crack down on fentanyl. I think they'll lean on the cartels and say, we can't move fentanyl right now. You've got to stop moving fentanyl. We've got $500 billion worth of goods and services we sell to the United States. And these are at risk because of you guys selling a bunch of dope.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Ioan Grillo. Subscribe at undercurrents.tv to join the Undercurrents community for just $1 for your first month. Also subscribe over on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts as well. Now on to the news. As Donald Trump negotiated with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum over his proposed 25% tariff on Monday, Representative Byron Donalds said this on Fox Business.
The drug cartels have had operational control of both of our borders, Larry. This has got to change. Donald Trump promised it, and he has delivered.
Now, many are debating whether Trump got much out of either country, but Byron Donalds, Republican from Florida, his claim is important because Trump needed to declare an emergency in order to claim presidential authority for the tariffs, rather than going through Congress. So Sheinbaum herself agreed to send troops to the border, and Justin Trudeau said Canada would be taking additional steps to stop the flow of fentanyl south to the US as well. One of his announcements was actually that Canada would designate cartels as terrorist groups. Joshua Trevino joined our show on Inauguration Day to weigh in on Trump's decision to do the same right after assuming office. As we covered here on Monday, whether fentanyl and crime are the only issues Trump wants Mexico and Canada to come to the table on is actually unclear. The White House fact sheet cited economic concerns as well, and it's possible that we see more on that front in the days to come. Now, Trevino is out in The Spectator with a response to the White House fact sheet on tariffs, which spoke of a, quote, intolerable alliance between cartels and the Mexican government. Trevino makes the case that AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, and the, quote, men and women holding office in Morena Party posts have sold their national patrimony in some fashion to cartels that are now recognized as of January 20th by the U.S. as foreign terror organizations. He adds, quote, Mexican consulates across America render aid to illegal aliens in the United States, protecting the remittances that are a major source of cartel income. It is necessary to understand that the Mexican state is now essentially a single-party left populist regime aligned ideologically and operationally with comparable regimes in Cuba and Venezuela. Like those regimes, it regards its nation's trafficking cartels as vehicles for profit and control and also agents of national policy abroad, especially but not only in the United States, end quote. Now, another of my very favorite journalists, the Mexico-based writer Ioan Grillo, wrote a post on his Substack CrashOut agreeing there is, quote, massive narco corruption in Mexico. But Grillo also turns the spotlight back on America, adding, quote, we also cannot understand the drug trade without looking at the complicity of U.S. businesses and elements of U.S. law enforcement. Grillo says, quote, elements of the CIA have worked with traffickers from Southeast Asia to Central America. Various city police officers and DEA agents themselves have been convicted of working with drug dealers. Major cartel figures who flip to become snitches can get sweetheart deals from U.S. prosecutors. U.S. gun shops and factories are estimated to provide more than 200,000 firearms a year to Mexican criminals. U.S. banks launder drug dollars. TD Bank was recently fined $3 billion for failing to properly monitor cash from cartels. Okay, so Sheinbaum has referred to the Trump administration's, quote, intolerable alliance claims as, quote, slander, and pointed back at U.S. gun shops as Grillo did. Trump is moving swiftly and aggressively to curb illegal immigration and asylum abuses. The tariffs are on pause for a month. Border crossings are down, but shortly after his confirmation, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth refused to rule out military strikes against the cartels. Quote, all options will be on the table, he said. In order to understand what should be done, we should understand what's happening right now. So I'm pleased that Ioan Grillo, who writes the incredible CrashOut Substack, with great risk to his own safety, by the way, is joining us now to talk about what could happen and what is happening. Ioan, thank you for being here.
Yeah, great to be here, Emily.
Now, you've written such an interesting piece on your Substack CrashOut, and I want to start first by asking part one and part two. Part one is about narco corruption in Mexico, the truth about it. There's a lot of allegations flying around, but if you could start by telling us the truth about that, and then I'm going to ask you about something you covered, which is really important, American complicity in that corruption. But if we start just with narco corruption in Mexico, what is the truth about the ties between many of these cartels, particularly Sinaloa, which you have covered for a long time from Mexico, and the Scheinbaum administration and, actually the party more broadly?
Yeah, sure thing. So just a bit of background for some of the viewers to see a bit where I'm coming from. I've been here 23 years working in Mexico, covering the cartels for all this time in every state in Mexico and all of this violence. Anybody who's covered this knows that narco corruption is a huge issue here. There's no doubt about that. You could even talk about state capture or parts of the Mexican state apparatus being captured by cartels. The thing is about this is it's endemic, massive across many levels of government, and it's right across various administrations. So this has been going on for decades. Just to give a bit of a sense what that means in practice, a couple of stories on a lower level of the state working or different levels with the state working with the cartel. There was one police commander in the state of Michoacan. He was known as El Tyson. He was quite friendly with journalists and seemed like a good guy, seemed like a guy who was kind of, fighting the organized crime. And then it came not out that not only was he working for the cartel, not only was he a ranking member of the cartel, not only was he participating in really brutal, violent acts, he was also training the young recruits how to like chop up body parts. And he was like, he confessed on camera to this, how he'd go out there and he'd get these young recruits, and to make them lose their fear of blood, he's like, we'll show you how to cut up body parts. So as a journalist covering this, these are the kind of cops you're dealing with. You can be going out with these guys who are really ranking cartel members. I just recently published a report with the cell phone records of a plaza boss, and a plaza is a cartel territory for the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And it showed in his phone records, were very interesting, gave a real insight into the way the cartels work at a local level. And it showed all these different government officials that he had in his payroll, with even the amounts he was paying. What was very interesting in the report done by a young member of the federal prosecutors, although the report was kind of buried until it was leaked to me, was that he did a big analysis of all of these different records and payment records that were blatantly on the phone, and payment of his hitmen, and payment of members of the military, members of the federal prosecutors, members of state police and local police. It came to about 30% of what he was making from drugs, which was similar to a business tax. So actually the kind of ways kind of baked in that the organized crime was paying the state a form of taxation, but through corruption. And then a third story of more high-level corruption. Former public security secretary, the guy who was kind of called like the anti-drug czar. He was a very key figure in terms of fighting drug cartels under President Felipe Calderon in a big war on drugs, which America, the United States, was very much deeply involved in. And he made the biggest, most record-breaking cocaine of all time, which I covered at the time, of 23.5 tons of cocaine worth billions on the street. And it turned out that, I interviewed him at the time, sat down with him at the time there during this administration. He was later arrested and convicted of cocaine trafficking and working with cartels. And I went to some of his trial in New York. And during that trial, it came out, according to one of the witnesses, and there's questions about these witnesses because these are cartel figures who basically flip and become snitches and testify. But it came out that 23 tons of cocaine, the bricks, was sold back to the cartel. We'd seen it as journalists burned in a big bonfire, and it was sold back to the cartel. What we were seeing, according to the witness, burned in a bonfire, was actually packets of like flour and sugar they'd mixed together and made them look like cocaine bricks, but really they were fake cocaine bricks, and they're taking it back. So that gives a sense of just how deep the corruption is across the board. Now, specifically, the claims on the current administration, there hasn't been any evidence presented against President Claudia Sheinbaum, especially. It was more against the administration of the previous president, Andres Manuel López Obrador, who's our mentor, and against the Morena party. There's been no charges said against López Obrador, but there's been former DA investigations leaked about alleged money going to his political campaigns. And considering how broad corruption is across the board in Mexico, it's quite credible to believe that there's accusation, right across the board.
So this brings us to the second part of the question, because the DEA involvement here probably raises some people's eyebrows. Obviously, I think this was, like you said, it was leaked. The DEA had been looking into potential connections between AMLO and Sinaloa back in the aughts, and the suspicion is that it's continued up until very recently. But you make an important point, and I imagine it's one that you hear frequently in Mexico, and probably in Morena circles, that the United States doesn't have the moral high ground in this conversation about Mexico being a narco state, because the United States has sort of enabled the transition to narco state. Tell us about that argument, a little bit about the evidence, and how the United States has been complicit in the Mexican narco state.
Yeah, sure. So, you can see corruption within United States agencies as well. And this is actually a complaint coming from the current administration. They're also saying, they're attacking many of the old deep state in the state for being corrupt. The United States government and certain agencies have worked with drug traffickers around the world. In Afghanistan, when the Brits and the Americans ran Afghanistan for 20 years, it was the biggest heroin producer on the planet. Going back to the 1980s, you have the CIA running the Contra Army against Nicaragua from Costa Rica and Honduras, and evidence of some Contras being involved in cocaine. Going back to Vietnam, you have, and Laos, you have a military, a guerrilla army, the secret army, on behalf of the CIA, running and also involved in opium and heroin there. So you've got that section. Then you got to look at border agents. So there's been since the Department of Homeland Security was created, you've had more than 100 agents, including Border Patrol and Customs Enforcement, convicted of working with drug traffickers or people smugglers, with cartels. There's a lot more out there who haven't been convicted. When they have customs agents, it's a very good catch for them, because a customs agent, if they're on duty and they're bringing drugs through the border, if they're bringing fentanyl through the border, and most fentanyl going through the Mexican border to the United States is coming through what they call the ports of entry, meaning the official land crossings, rather than through the desert or over the river. If you've got a customs agent on duty, then they can just wait. They've got the details. They know what the license plates of the car with the fentanyl is in. They wave it through. It's hard to prove they were complicit. Some of these people who have been convicted, they were recruited, and it's not only the money, though there's obviously a lot of money involved, it's also the honey trap they used to recruit some of these agents in border cities, places like San Diego, where they'll be going to a gym, and there'll be women who are cartel operatives who could be working as strippers, or what they call buchonas in Mexico, very much the kind of narco girlfriends cultures, a lot of plastic surgery, who then recruit these agents, begin going out, seeing these agents, and then start bringing them and introducing them to the cartel figures. So you've got that issue of the corrupt agents there. You also have the issue of informants or snitches and these deals given to drug traffickers, which is quite scandalous if you look at this. I mentioned this earlier in the trial of Garcia Luna, but some of these major drug traffickers, like this guy called Chupeta, who's a Colombian drug trafficker, who admitted on the stand to murdering well over 100 people, or ordering the murders of people. He had plastic surgery all these times. He had a kind of pretty terrifying face, testified against El Chapo, and he was given a deal. And there was dozens and dozens of these guys who could be high-ranking cartel guys who then snitch on other guys and are given deals, and then end up living in the United States, and then end up with their money, which is hidden away, spending that money. So you've got corruption there. And that's one thing when you see suddenly they find out, well, American agents are meeting with drug traffickers in a certain place, that's what sparks this. You saw in Mexico City that D agents had met with the son of El Mayo Zambado, who's a big trafficker right now. Um, and then you also have the issue of massive laundering of money in US banks. You've had a recent big $3 billion fine over this. That's a very big fact. You've got the issue of gun shops and the issue of firearms being trafficked from the United States to Mexico, a very big issue, which could come up with the terrorist designation of some of these people providing them guns as being providing material to terrorist organizations.
That's a really important point. I saw you making that the other day. I just want to ask you more about that point because the gun shop owners in the United States are Trump friendly, to say the least. And with the designation of cartels as terrorist organizations, some of these people who presumably have ties into gun rights groups, firearm rights groups, could actually be implicated in arming and providing material support to terrorist groups if their weapons from Texas or California are ending up in the hands of cartels. Tell us more about that. That seems really significant.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest way that cartels acquire guns in the United States is through straw buyers, meaning somebody with a clean record who's paid to go and buy guns for the cartel. Previously, and if you look at a lot of these cases, there's a case where an Iraq vet went into a pawn shop in Texas and bought 10 AK-47s. He was paid $600 by a cartel guy from the Zetas to buy them for the plus the price of the rifle, so $60 a rifle just for the going in there. He was buying marijuana off this cartel guy, and he recruited him to go and buy the guns. So he bought the 10 AK-47s, provided to the cartel. One of these guns was used in an attack and murder of a US agent in Mexico. The guy who bought the guns, they traced it, found the guy who bought the guns. His punishment, probation for buying guns for the cartel. His crime, lying on the form when he said, "Are the guns for you?" He said, "Yes," and they would. That was his crime, punishment, probation. That has changed a bit now with the 2022 Bipartisan Safe Communities Act. But with the terrorist thing, that same person could be charged with providing material for a terrorist organization. So I think first, before the gun shops, it'll be the straw buyers who could be charged with this. And that could be 25 years rather than probation. So a very, very big change. Now, for me, that's not a bad thing. If they do, if they designate them as terrorists and they want to use for people who are buying knowingly, if you can prove you're knowingly buying, a bunch of AK-47s for a drug cartel who are committing mass murder, including the murder of American agents, it's not a bad thing that they can give them higher sentences. Now, some of the gun shops where they can prove that gun shops are complicit, if the person didn't know, although there's a question when you sell 10 AK-47s, or in some cases when they sell more than 500 guns to private citizens in deals. But if they can prove that the gun shop is complicit and that they know and they're selling guns under the counter to the cartel, then they could do them. And there are some shops where that's the case. Some shops in Arizona, Texas, that's the case. Again, the vast majority of gun shops don't want to do this, don't want to provide guns to cartels. I don't think this is a partisan issue. I don't think it's an anti-gun issue in itself. When I did the research for this, I talked to the president of the AR-15 Owners of America to say, do you want to supply? Are you concerned about guns supplying the cartels? And so it's a big hot issue there. But as I said, the last issue about the kind of complicity of the United States is the fact that in the United States, there's a drug consumption market worth, according to the RAND Corporation, about $146 billion. That's what Americans spend on illegal drugs. So many places in the United States, you can see people blatantly selling drugs. I was reporting in Baltimore, close to where you are, watching people sell heroin openly on the street and sell dope openly on the street. So that's, interesting as well. It's obviously a different type of corruption, but it's the fact that the United States doesn't stop at a domestic level the drug trade happening.
So this is a really interesting segue into the question of what happens to the cartels, who have obviously seen a lot of revenue streams popping in the last, over the course of the Biden administration and before that as well. if Donald Trump is cracking down on border crossings and freezing asylum, and genuinely, if he has a successful immigration crackdown, on top of that, if you actually are cracking down on fentanyl consumption in the United States and people's ability to get it into the United States, if this is a significant undercutting of cartel profits, what happens to the geopolitics of Mexico and the rest of the Caribbean, Latin America, places where these are huge. I mean, these are huge economic powerhouses that employ people and support local economies. All of that, like, just help me piece together like where else they're going to look for that to make up the revenue.
Yeah, sure. So the cartels have proven over decades to be so extremely adaptable to the different challenges and to different streams of revenue. So if you go back, I mean, going back 15 years, they were massive marijuana smugglers. There was huge amounts of marijuana being grown in Mexico and being smuggled to the United States. I wrote editorials back then, back in 2010, saying, legalize marijuana to try and reduce the power of cartels. I thought that would really damage the cartels, taking away the marijuana revenue. Legalization in the United States has indeed devastated the cartels' marijuana business, but I was wrong. It didn't reduce the power of cartels. They're more powerful now than they were beforehand. So I hold up my hands about being wrong about many of these things. But one thing is they adapted so they adapted to synthetic drugs. Now, the synthetic drug revolution is actually fairly recently. I mean, you can go back to the 2000s and this figure called Shenli Yigung, who was a Chinese naturalized Mexican who first connected the Mexican cartels to the Chinese pharmaceutical industry. And he's got a crazy story about, laundering money through Las Vegas and hundreds of, how he had a house with $205 million in cash here in Mexico City. But the actual real revolution, the real change to fentanyl, which has really heated up this issue, is fairly recently. It's only a few years ago during the pandemic, you started to see fentanyl being higher than heroin coming through. They also took massive advantage, like you mentioned, of the huge numbers of people coming through Mexico for the Biden administration. Going back 15 years in Mexico, the majority of people crossing the US border without papers were Mexicans, just crossing the border without papers. During the more recent years, especially during the Biden administration, the majority were people outside of Mexico, especially other Latin Americans, people from Honduras and Venezuela, but people from India, China, Russia, and all over the place coming through, and huge numbers of them asking for asylum in the United States. Now, cartels would still take advantage of them. They would sometimes kidnap and get ransom money for these people going through, or they would also take them over the border. So if you can cross the border, you pay us, we'll take you over the border and you hand yourself in to the Border Patrol where you can ask for asylum. Now, right now, the border, asylum is dead. I mean, the numbers have gone down massively. Basically, the number of asylum seekers are way down. But the cartels can still go back to their old business of, okay, we'll sneak you into the United States. We've got tunnels. We've got boats. We can walk over the desert. We've got ways, we go over the river and still we've got people and we've got drones and really, so they still go back to this business. Now, one of the difficult challenges of fighting organized crime is the more security there is, the higher price they charge. The higher price they charge, the more profits there is for them. So this has been a difficult thing the whole time. I talked to a people smuggler over in Nogales in the last Trump administration. He said, "Oh, great, Trump's going to make a lot of money for us because we're going to put the prices right up, so it's more difficult." And they did. They made a huge amount of money since then. With fentanyl, I believe currently with the pressure of Donald Trump after the threat of tariffs, Mexico will effectively crack down on fentanyl. And I think it will actually do it partly because of the corruption means it can do it. I think they'll lean on the cartels and say, we can't move fentanyl right now. You've got to stop moving fentanyl. We've got $500 billion worth of goods and services we sell to the United States. And these are at risk because of you guys selling a bunch of dope. They're going to lean on them to reduce the amount of fentanyl. But where's that fentanyl going to go? Where are the people in the United States who want to buy dope and get high going to get that from? And they're going to move it through the Caribbean. they could make it in the United States itself. Canada's also under pressure there as well. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to see how that moves as well. But the cartels also, they're still moving other drugs. They're still moving crystal meth. It hasn't, been raised. Crystal meth, still a huge amount of crystal meth. A lot of communities, a lot of people know in these small towns in the United States, meth is a big deal. They're still moving cocaine. And they've also got the European market, which is huge for cocaine. But in Mexico, they've also got huge amounts of shakedowns. Now, one risk is when they suddenly run out of money from fentanyl, they go, okay, we're going to have to tax local businesses to make us pay money for what we're losing on the fentanyl. So like extortion in Mexico is a huge deal. They run wildcat mines. For times they were providing China with a lot of material from wildcat mines. They're robbing the Mexican oil industry and selling and stealing oil, some which could then end up in the United States. They're also taxing imports coming from the United States. We talk about Donald Trump putting tariffs on. The cartel effectively have their tariffs over in Tamaulipas state, which is on the border with Texas and the Rio Grande Valley area. That's the territory of the Gulf Cartel, and they tax tanker trucks of oil coming over. They put up to like $1,200. They'll tax that. There's even a thing shown of all different goods that people bring into Mexico with different rates that the cartel would tax. So they've got a lot of ways of making money, and they're very adaptable. And I think they're very, very far from over.
So tell us about Claudia Sheinbaum, because Donald Trump had a really interesting relationship with AMLO, where it was so strange, and you can tell us more about it. But as his mentor, I wonder, Sheinbaum came out this week and actually said it was great that USAID was folding at the hands of Elon Musk, which was super interesting. Bukele said something similar, as a very different politician said something similar. But is it possible that Trump has a relationship with Sheinbaum that is in both countries' interests, or is it sort of destined, from your perspective, to fall apart given, Trump's, I guess, what's the right way to put this? I don't want to say imperialist, but his, designs on really reasserting control over the hemisphere.
So I think it could go either way. I think it definitely could go well. So one reason that López Obrador and Trump got on well is they have some similarities. They're both populists. They both, if you look at their rhetoric, very clearly appeal to the people against the elite. In Mexico, Obrador called it La Mafia del Poder, the mafia of power. They both are nationalists. López Obrador and the Morena Party are very clear nationalists. They say we've got to fight for the interests of the Mexican nation, and Trump said we've got to put America first. So they can both have those policies and then find agreements where there's things in interest of having two big countries in North America. Now, on the other side, you've got some hawks in the United States who I think very mistakenly equate Mexico right now to the Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba axis. It's very different. Mexico right now is very different from those countries. I've reported in all four of those countries. In Cuba and Venezuela, Nicaragua is completely different. They're way more authoritarian. And they're countries which have economically, Nicaragua actually is economically pretty capitalist, although it's an authoritarian regime which uses some socialist rhetoric. Venezuela, completely collapsed as an economy, and that's why you had 7 million people fleeing there, and it's very authoritarian. Mexico, it's very different. You don't have that feeling here, and I really, advise people making claims about Mexico being in that same camp. Spend some time in Mexico, how you feel here. Really look at the way that the press are here, the political opposition are here, and compare that. And it's pretty tough to go in there, but compare that to how you feel in Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba, where it's completely night and day going in there as a journalist. Mexico is a very violent country. Absolutely, it's very, very violent. But it's not authoritarian. There's been a lot of journalists killed here, and there's been friends of mine, journalists who have been murdered here. But it's not in that same way as a top-down authoritarianism in the same way that those countries are. And I don't think it's really, in a way, very hardcore socialist. They don't use the word socialist, in fact, the government here, in that way. They use the idea of promoting the poor, and one thing um, that López Obrador did, which Claudia Sheinbaum was trying to follow, is they did shift some of the wealth to poor people. They put up minimum wage. They they put up wages and made stronger contracts for workers. They put up social programs. We'll see how they're sustained. But they, considering how unequal it was, that was very much a vote-winning program. But at the same time, they're quite, the government, particularly López Obrador, was quite socially conservative. I think a lot of social conservatives in the United States would be quite happy with a lot of his views there. So I think the other thing is the way that it could go wrong is how hawkish. You've got kind of a hawkish element in the United States right now who really want to kind of go down to Mexico and shoot some people up and shoot some cartels up and kind of name some names, and that could make things go pretty wrong pretty fast.
I want to get your thoughts on that, actually, because Pete Hegseth, defense secretary, now confirmed, was saying just in the last couple of days that all options will be on the table when it comes to potential military strikes in Mexico. And you can envision something very targeted and very precise. You could envision something along the lines of a quagmire that sends more and more refugees across the border into the United States. And you've put a lot of thought into this, especially as we hear from more hawkish people in the Trump administration, emboldened, and by the way, not unreasonably so, given what happened over the course of the Biden administration and the levels of corruption in Mexico. But there are pitfalls that are so patently obvious, some that are less obvious, but you've given some thought to them. So could you just give us your perspective on how easily that could go wrong?
Yeah, sure thing. So first, I mean, to say with some of the hawks, I agree with them on two issues and disagree with them on a third. I can agree with them that the fentanyl crisis really was a genuine, I mean, catastrophe in the United States. And, more than 700,000 people dying of overdoses in the last, decade or so. That's absolute catastrophe. I've met a lot of people whose children, whose family members have died of overdoses, and I can really appreciate that. I don't think that was given enough attention, and I think that was one of the issues which Trump won on. I also agree with people that the cartels are a genuine, real deep problem, and it's not good for the United States to have cartels with militias going around, right over their border, and they do a lot of crazy stuff. And I've covered personally a lot of the atrocities, the mass graves they've left, the shootouts and all of these things. The third thing is, though, where I disagree is really what you're going to achieve with military strikes. I think a lot of people are hungry for seeing some action, way of, it's kind of meat for the Trump base. Or if they were to send a team of commandos over and blow the hell out of some cartel people, or do a drone strike on a fentanyl lab, I think a lot of people would cheer that, and that would look, oh, here's America's back and we're fighting. But what would you actually achieve by that? Now, there was a study, in the magazine Science, done by some mathematicians to make a study to try and understand the amount of people working for cartels, and they estimated around 180,000 people work for cartels in Mexico. I believe that's an underestimate. It's probably hundreds of thousands. So really what we're talking about is very extensive organizations with deep corruption that do include police and military on their payroll, who have these sicarios, but also inside cities in camps. So what you achieve by going over, if there are 180,000, and even if you were to kill 1,000 cartel members, like, let alone just do one strike and kill 10, even if you were to kill 1,000, that's less than 1% of these people that you're killing. And what are the downsides? Okay, you go in there, you kill some civilians. It's going to be pretty hard to know. I mean, even if you go in cartel, these are in cities, in villages. You go in there, you're going to really know identify they're all cartel people. They're going to claim they're civilians, and how are you going to know? And if you do kill a bunch of civilians, what's the reaction going to be in Mexico? And then how's Mexico going to be? And Claudia Sheinbaum she's kind of balancing this of compromising with Trump and giving Trump what he wants in terms of, okay, we're going to reduce fentanyl, we're going to stop migrants, we'll send troops to the border, and to sell this to the Mexican people is, I'm standing up for Mexico, I'm representing you. And the accusations are coming at her, from the opposition of, oh no, you're selling out, you're not really defending Mexican interests. So if the US starts to do that, does the situation become weaker of how she can really work with Trump? So there's definitely a downside there. And like I say, I guess the US should try and figure out um, its strategic objectives here. Like, covering this for a lot of years, the fact that the status quo is being broken, I'm not saying that's terrible because the status quo was bad. The status quo is a lot of violence in Mexico, a lot of overdoses in the United States. But if you kind of really want to get into a military conflict, and then how deep in do you get, it can go wrong in many ways.
So, on that point, Mexico is also, like many countries, sensitive about its sovereignty. And from what I understand, AMLA was sensitive about even having American intelligence trying to inform on cartels, trying to embed on cartels. And it sounds like as the US tries to figure out its strategic incentives or its actual genuine strategy, its outcome strategy, that's something that Scheinbaum is probably front of mind for her, is looking like she's a sovereign leader and Mexico remains Mexico, not something that is like unduly under the sway of the United States. Am I right in that? It seems like a serious sensitivity for her.
Absolutely, spot on. I mean, basically, Mexico is very proud of its sovereignty. It's a big part of the identity. So there's no way it would allow US troops to kind of operate on Mexican soil. Now, the issue around agents here has been controversial, and there's an issue when Chapo was arrested, the second of three times because he escaped twice from prison in Mexico. There was a video showing, and you see what appears to be a US agent, which I think it was a US agent there with the Mexican forces during the arrest. And that was very controversial. There's one agent, let alone allowing kind of US teams. Now, US has been around for a long time, involved in training in Mexico. One thing, I talked to somebody recently at the US Embassy about this. One, they're trying to say, can we push this up to more advisor status? So we're more involved with advising and we're trying to sort of bring in more. And maybe Claudia Sheinbaum can sell that as a compromise. And then Trump can claim that as a win there. But basically, I think to kind of say will allow US physical troops on the ground so we can kind of see images of them, along with Mexican troops blasting in somebody's firefights. I think that's politically, I think politically impossible. But then, yeah, I've been wrong about many of these things.
I could keep going on for a long time, but my last question is about how all of this could potentially destabilize the entire hemisphere, the entire region, given that my understanding is Sinaloa, other cartels have business all the way down into South America, places like Ecuador. It's not to say that cartels shouldn't go, it's just to say that efforts to destabilize cartels would have ripple effects down throughout the rest of Latin America. Can you tell us a little bit about how a cartel crackdown could affect the region more broadly? As Marco Rubio, somebody who's a hawk on a lot of these things, or long has been a hawk on a lot of these things, is coming in and overseeing this as Secretary of State. Like, what could we expect with a cartel crackdown in the rest of the region?
Yeah, so a lot of the time, when you try and do things right, you end up causing more problems. And so we've seen, what people call the kingpin strategy of bringing down the top guys. So when the DEA was first formed in 1973, they said we can't do nickel and dime arrests of people on street corners. So we'll allow those people to sell on street corners. Like I was saying earlier, we'll go after the top guys and we'll build conspiracy charges. So they build these conspiracy charges and with these dubious deals made to these narco traffickers and take down El Chapo and then recently take down El Mayo when it was kind of a rendition, a kidnapping of him maybe by a rival cartel on behalf of the United States, but take down him. And then it just provokes more and more violence. And what you see is you take down a kingpin, so the guys underneath, and the guys underneath them, they're more violent and they're fighting over the empire, and they're doing more, other more antisocial crimes of kidnapping or shakedowns and killing more people. So we've seen that cycle in Mexico right now, following the rendition of El Mayo Zambada to the United States. He's currently in New York in prison. There's been this massive war in Sinaloa. I was up there in September when it first kicked off. But this war has basically made everyone stay in their houses for months They call it the narco pandemic. It's like the pandemic, they're staying in their houses, but because of the narco violence, the figures there are now in the thousands of dead and disappeared. So often law enforcement creates more problems. Saying that, the problems are already pretty crazy, and they have been for some time across Latin America in terms of gangs and cartel members. You go down through the hemisphere to Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador pre-Bukele, Ecuador, as you say, big issue with cartels, Colombia, Venezuela, and many of these countries suffering cartel violence and gang violence. One of the main reasons that people were citing for when they arrived to ask for asylum was running from this cartel and gang violence. And some of them had solid case. Some of them have been given asylum because they've had a threat from a cartel. And they said the cartel works with the government. So I've effectively been threatened by the cartel working with the government. I'm not safe. I've got to leave the country, and have been granted asylum in US courts because of that. That's obviously going to become more difficult. So the situation is already explosive. It's already very, very explosive, but these things are kind of flaring up and down. One trend we're seeing is with Ecuador, Noboa, and Bukele is a move towards more authoritarian governments in Latin America. And you've seen, with Bukele, who deliberately courted the Trump administration, and he locked up 1% of his population over a 9-month period, in addition to another 1% already there. So it'd be like in the US, locking up an extra 3.5 million people in prison over a 9-month period. It was a very, very hard crackdown and very effective and very well supported, but basically trampling on, saying you're in prison, bang, you're going to do 25 years and we're going to rush you through courts. We're going to see these more authoritarian governments. And I think, you see the US allying with them. Personally, as a US diplomat, a US figure, I'll be very careful about getting too close to some of the Latin American strongmen right now, like Bukele, because in the future, you might say this guy's very, very popular, but in the future, when it comes out, there's a lot of dead bodies, under some of these people. You want to be careful about being there. But just, with this situation, you hope it can get better with some of these issues of the violence and of the drugs. But sometimes, even with good intentions, these things can just get worse and worse. And so we'll see in this explosive time where that leads to.
Okay, this was fascinating. Ioan, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for everything you're doing at CrashOut, and thank you for coming on the program.
Big fan of the show. Yeah, great to be here.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. Remember to subscribe over at undercurrents.tv. You get premium episodes, you get an email address where you can contact me, ask me questions that I can answer here on the show for subscribers only. Subscribe on the YouTube channel, wherever you download your podcast. It helps us so much. Leave a review. We really appreciate it. We'll be back here with more Undercurrents soon.